everybody, welcome to the channel. Alright, so it's been a long time coming, but I've got a new piece out called H.A. Carmichael. This was inspired by the Umbrella Academy. Here's a reference photo that I took actually off my TV as I was watching the TV show on Netflix, and this is what I ended up with as something of a final piece. So I used that background as something of a reference here, but I did make some small tweaks on my own, and I'll kind of point them out as I go along. I want to start here by talking a little bit about the formation of this drawing. The idea that I had in my head in terms of the overall composition was that I wanted to really kind of capture this notion of H.A. Carmichael, this really interesting character of a sentient fish that lives in something of a fishbowl on top of a robotic type body. Well, this fishbowl was what fascinated me. This idea that it was glass, but water was inside it, you have a fish floating in it, and in a lot of ways it's going to be really difficult to render because the background in some way, shape, and form is reflected in the glass and also in the water. So the reference photos on this were really important to me because I wanted to make sure I tried to capture that trick of that reflection in the glass properly. And then to complicate things a little bit more, there are a few other of these dome-type trophies scattered around this character's office that also have that glass property and in some cases some reflection of the background also. I have a tendency with my compositions to kind of get a little bit ambitious. Actually, too ambitious might be the way to put it. I get this idea that I want to draw a character because they're really interesting to me, and then suddenly I feel this need or a desire to try to create some sort of a narrative type illustration out of it, and that means a background and something else to maybe potentially interact with. And again, the ideas when it comes to that narrative type mentality kind of blow up pretty quickly and get almost too ambitious and intimidating and sometimes even unachievable. I can't tell you how many drawings I've kind of started, gotten halfway through, can't get the composition right and just throw it away and you'll never see it. But this is one that happened to work out, and it was really a passion project here, so to kind of speak to it, this is from the Umbrella Academy, a show that's in its second season on Netflix. I had a couple of days off work and basically binge watched the entire thing and fell in love with it. Now, a little bit of background just in case you're wondering. This is based off a comic book series written by Gerard Way, and to kind of put in another kind of degree of detail in this, Gerard Way, in addition to being the writer of this comic book series, is also the singer and songwriter for My Chemical Romance. So I'll put that aside there, let you go check it out on your own. It's a great show, highly recommend it, and this is one of the characters in it that just fascinated me. Now, let's speak to the drawing. One of the beautiful things that I love about working in a digital medium like Procreate is this idea of being able to work in layers, and drawing this fish is a perfect example of where I take advantage of this. When I'm working in really complex compositions, I tend to use a lot of layers, and using layers in this fashion allows me to draw these individual elements like the fish, for instance, get in as much detail as I want, and then shrink it and move it around the page to ultimately place it where I want it to be. And then I can keep these elements separate on so many different layers, ultimately changing the composition as I go until I finally kind of dial in where I want all the little objects to sit, and then collapse all those layers together into one final kind of rough drawing, rough composition, if you will, that I can use to start rendering my ink layer, which is what you see me getting into right now. Now, a brief word on the canvas here. I get some questions about it. Now, I like to work with a lot of layers, and that's going to become pretty evident when we get into the coloring phase. So I have a pretty large layer stack with this. There's a lot going on with the detail. 55 layers is my maximum on this one, and the way that I achieve that is by basically working in a 3:4 ratio. In pixels, that really kind of amounts to roughly 2,600 pixels by 450, somewhere in there, and a 300 DPI based off the type of iPad that I have. That gives me 55 layers in Procreate. If you have any questions about that, feel free to leave it in the comments, but I'll let you know that I'm not really all that up to date on the most modern iPad. I think I'm like one generation behind or something like that. Now, I do have my rough drawing and composition done, so I'm moving into the inking phase at this point. And to kind of give you an idea of what's coming, I color much like coloring works for comic book artists. So big bold outlines with something that almost is reminiscent of an ink brush, if you will. Once that's done, I'll try to kind of emphasize some dark blacks in there, again, much like you'd see in some sort of like a comic book drawing. And then when it comes time for the coloring phase, Get in midtones, just something that kind of fits the middle of the color spectrum that you want, and then add shadow and light to that to darken some areas, lighten some areas, and then try to get a three-dimensional effect as a result. The main difference here is that, again, I'm going to take advantage of the layer stack in order to be able to separate elements to make it easier to paint in those shadows and lights when the time comes. Now, what I'm working on right now is a great example of this, the domes. I'm getting the ink layer in for the domes so I have a really good definition of where those lines are going to be. But when it comes down to it, each of those domes are on their each individual separate layer. And really it amounts to the reasoning I kind of mentioned a little bit before. I'm going to render glass out of this, or at least try to create an effect that looks like glass. And so each of those domes has to be separate from the bookcase so I can try to pull off the effect that I'm going for. I could probably keep everything on one layer and just preserve some layers, but it's just going to make it a little bit more difficult to work that way, so it's easier to keep it separate. I can fool around with it a little bit separately in its own element, and once I get the trick to work, if I want to later, I can collapse layers and try to get more out of it that way. But it actually kind of worked out quite well to keep everything separate, so it's a method that works for me, and I think I'm just going to kind of continue to do it that way. As we move into my the next couple of things here, you may notice that everything's getting really odd coloring put in here, and this is mostly just so I can kind of separate my layers out and kind of see how my stack is supposed to sit from bottom to top. So to just review that really quick, bookcase is in the background. That is separated into two layers. The line work layer, that's just the black lines, and then the coloring. Then on top of that are the domes that are sitting on the bookcases. In front of that, we have the torso, again, a line work layer, then the color layer. The helmet is its own layer, with the fish its own layer. And then we get into the arms, and then the foreground, which includes the desk and all the objects on it. And then one last layer that kind of floats in the middle somewhere, and that's the domes that kind of frame the piece along with the desk lamp that's going to provide us something of a light source. Now let's speak to the glass trick that's happening here. Because my line work for these domes are on their own separate layer, just the black line work, I can go in, set a layer for that to auto lock, which means that I can color over top of the lines but not color outside what already exists there in terms of pixels. So I can just change the color of that line work at will without overcoloring it. And what I can do there is just change from black to my light source color, and that's how I kind of pull off the effect. Now in addition to that, I'm also taking kind of a soft airbrush and using a whitish yellow light, or whitish yellow color rather, to kind of paint in some stripes along those domes, indicating where the light source is coming from. Now in my mind's eye, there's a window on the right hand side off frame that we can't see, and daylight is spilling in. That's my light source, and then in addition to that, there's also again a desk lamp that's also providing light from that same direction, so it becomes pretty easy to figure out where I'm going to be putting these highlights on the domes. I tend to work backward and forward here, so now that I've got my bookcase mostly laid in here, I'm going to start moving into my foreground and get some of that stuff in too. But notice the touch-up pieces that I'm putting into the bookcase right now. Shadow and light is important here, and in addition, all the little detail work I put in the spines. Now, it doesn't matter what's written there. I actually didn't even use any real letters or English or anything like that, and the reason for that is because I know a little bit later on, I'm going to blur this background slightly to help it sit in the background a little bit more and give this whole piece a little bit more of a depth to it. I don't want to do that yet, though. I've got all my rendering done here, but I'm going to wait to blur it later because I'm going to use this background intact in its sharp version to help me create the reflections in the glass that we're going to be seeing in AJ's dome head a little bit later on. So when we get to that part, I'll kind of speak to how I pull off the trick on that. But I think one of the great things about this is there are a lot of little details and tricks I kind of put in here as I went along. For example, a leather texture on the book, or the pinstriping that you kind of see on the suit that's getting laid in right now. As I worked in on the hands, I decided that both the arms could be on their same layer just to help me preserve a little bit. And let's speak to a little bit about how the shadow and the light's done. Now, there's a lot more detail on how I pull off this shadow and light trick in some other videos, so go check them out if you give a chance. But it really just kind of amounts to the palette that you see right there laying on top of the nameplate on the desk. I have two shadow colors, and I have three light colors, a yellow, a kind of yellowish white, and then a kind of a bright white. Now the idea here is that I use blend modes in order to pull off the trick of shadow and light. So what I'll do is I'll set a layer over top of whatever I've already colored in, for instance the lamp there. And I will set that layer to multiply. Then I can use my bluish gray color. It's just a desaturated blue, mostly gray more than anything else, and I use that to paint over anything that I want to put in shadow. Now, because it's set to a multiply mode, all it really does is it lays kind of a grayish-blue glaze over the color, but the true color underneath of it will kind of come up and through it, so it creates its own kind of custom shadow color. And that's the beauty of it. I can put this blue-gray over top of any color, and it will work as a shadow, no matter where I put it. Again, I go into more detail about this in other videos and why and how that trick works and how to pull a similar effect for light, so go check them out. John Wick might be a good one to look at. I'll put a little card up in the corner there just to remind you to go take a look at that. And by the way, while I'm on the topic, if you haven't done so already, why don't you take a second and click on that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and hopefully if you got some value out of this, you feel that it's justified. And hey, if you got an itchy trigger finger, why don't you click on that like button too. Okay, so we're starting to move into some of the final phases of the rendering here, so let's talk a little bit about the trick with the glass. The dome that's on top of AJ's head here, right now is just a plain blue, and I'm going to get rid of that. It's just a placeholder so I know where the layer is for right now. What I'm really interested in more than anything else is the line work, the black lines that make up the outside of the dome, and that water line up at the top. And then in addition to that, I'm going to use the background to help inform what this reflection should be. So here's how the trick is pulled off. What I did was I made a copy of the background layer. What I ended up doing was taking the line work and the coloring and all the rendering that I did and just collapsed it all into one layer, so that way I could work with it almost like it's a separate picture from the rest. And then I just made a copy of it. And using that copy, I then cut out a piece of the bookcase that was directly behind AJ's head in the shape of that dome. Now you will see that get painted in a little bit later, or rather pasted in, I guess I should say, a little bit later. But it doesn't stop there. The idea is that this is a reflection, and the light is going to reflect it and make it curve around the top of the dome and around the sides of that curved dome also. So I had to manipulate a little bit. Just a flat representation of what that is wasn't going to be good enough. Otherwise, I could just use the background layer as is. So what I had to do instead was kind of select that little cutout that I took and then warp it. So the little arrow tool in the upper left-hand corner of the Procreate screen allows you to manipulate a selected object. So that's what I did, was I had this little cutout on its own little separate layer that I copied off to the side, and then I selected it, put that little manipulate tool on it, and chose the warp setting so that I could literally just kind of bend the size and manipulate it so it looked like it was shaped around the corners and the sides of the dome. Then it's just a little bit more of an effect trick after that. Lighten the opacity a little bit. Also, put maybe a little bit of a blue layer over top of a blue, maybe set it like a 10% opacity to help kind of make it look like it's in a water type environment. And really all this does is just kind of creates this effect that it does look like it's the background of that bookcase, but it's warped and slightly bluish, meaning that it's not quite blending in. And that little bit of standout is the trick on how that's pulled off. Now, that same effect is also attempted with the two domes on the left and the right-hand side. There'll be something of like a carving, a stone carving on the left one, a bird of some sort on the right one, but the glass effect with the highlight and then the warped background goes in. And if you notice, I actually experimented with the dome on the left with this warp effect before I tried it on AJ's head, seeing as AJ, or at least his head and the fish that's inside it, is really kind of meant to draw most of the focus here anyway. Now, a word about that too. I got done this piece a couple of days ago, and I posted it on a Facebook group I belong to and asked for some feedback, and somebody pointed out to me that the desk lamp actually was drawing a lot of focus, and that really wasn't the intent. The intent is to get your eyes focused on the dome with the goldfish in it. So what I had to do here was mess around with it a little bit to try to get your focus off that lamp and more onto the head in the center frame. So how? Well, remember the focus here is on the body in the middle here, so that means the background can be a little bit out of focus to give it depth, and I can pull a similar trick with the foreground. So with the lamp and with the two domes, I had them on their own separate layers, and I basically just blurred them, gave it a Gaussian blur at roughly about 5% or so, maybe even a little bit less. Just a little bit of a blur, just to make it look like it's a little bit out of balance with the rest, and that means your eye is going to get drawn to the center. Now that effect hasn't gone in yet. As a matter of fact, my blurring is just going into the bookcase right now, so you can see that going in. And when I realized the effect with the blur was going to be needed on the lamp is actually one of the last steps I added in, so we won't see until after the signature gets in and I'm kind of signing off at the end here. So having said that, we are reaching the end. I hope you liked this piece. Again, if you had any questions about any of the tricks or anything you want some more detail on, just leave a comment down below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stop back soon. I got more videos to come.